The lantern was already lit when Ellen Cord saw it, hanging from the center beam of the Mead barn, burning steady. No one had been inside since the evening before, and no one had lit it. She had gotten up for water past 11 and was standing at the kitchen window before going back to bed. The window faced east, toward the Mead farm across the lower field, and the lower field was dark the way fields were dark on a moonless October night, except for the barn. The Mead barn stood 100 yards from the Cord kitchen window, and the light coming through the gaps in the barn siding was unmistakable. The orange warm glow of a lantern inside a closed structure casting thin bright lines into the dark. A lantern in a barn at 11 at night meant a person in a barn at 11 at night. Ellen stood at the window and thought, Josiah is up late with something. Then she thought, Josiah is at his daughter's. He had left 2 days ago. She had watched him load the wagon on the morning of the 14th, a full load for a 2-day trip south. He had said he would be back by the 17th or 18th. He was not back. She had seen no wagon come up the valley road, and she would have seen it. Josiah Mead was not in the barn. She looked at the light for 20 minutes. It was steady. It did not move. It did not dim. It burned with the constancy of a lantern on a hook, which was exactly what it looked like, and no one was there to have hung it. She stood at the window and counted what she knew. Mead had left Thursday morning. Tonight was Friday, past 11. 36 hours of empty farm. No neighbor had been asked to watch it. No traveler would have access to his barn lantern. The light was there. It was steady. Nobody had lit it. She went and woke her husband. James Cord was a practical man with the practical man's resistance to being woken at 11 for something that had an explanation, and his first explanation was the most available one. Someone was in the barn. He said, a neighbor might have needed to use the shelter. He said, a traveler off the road. He said, the lantern has to have been lit by someone. Ellen said, go and see. He dressed and went. She watched from the window. He crossed the lower field in the dark, the field between the courthouse and the Mead barn, and she watched his lantern moving across the grass toward the barn, the small mobile light of her husband walking toward the large, steady light in the structure. He reached the barn door. She watched him open it and go inside. The light in the barn changed briefly. There was a moment of brighter light, the addition of his own lantern to whatever was in there, and then a settling. He was inside for several minutes. He came out and stood in the barnyard and looked back at the barn, and then he came back across the field. She met him at the kitchen door. He said, no one there. She said, are you sure? He said, I went through every stall, both levels. No one, no animal that shouldn't be there. The barn is empty. She said, the lantern. He said, yes. It's hanging on the center beam hook where Mead keeps it. It's lit. I don't know who lit it. There's no one there. He came inside and stood in the kitchen for a minute, and then he went back out. She watched him cross the field again, and go into the barn again and come back again. He said, I looked at the floor. The floor around the center beam is mud. It's been soft from the week's rain. There are no footprints. My own footprints going in just now are the only fresh marks in the floor. No one has walked to that lantern tonight. Ellen said, then who lit it? James said, I don't know. They stood in the kitchen and held that for a while. Then they went back to bed, but neither of them slept well, and both of them got up twice more to look at the barn from the window. And both times the light was there, burning steady in the dark of the closed structure. Josiah Mead had built the barn in the spring of 1851, 8 years before that October, and he knew it the way a man knew something he had built with his own hands and maintained with his own labor across the years between. He was 52 years old, a widower of 4 years, a farmer of 30 years in the Ozark Hollow country, who had the specific practical intelligence of a man for whom things that didn't work were a problem to be solved, and things that did work were to be maintained carefully. He had been alone on the farm since his wife Anna died, and he ran it with the economy and order of a man who had decided that the farm's continued functioning was the thing that was in his control, and that the farm's functioning depended on knowing the state of everything in it. The center beam hook, the hook from which the lantern hung that night, was a hook he had set himself, forged by the Hollow's blacksmith to his specification, sized for the particular lantern he used for barn work. The lantern itself was a good one, a 3-year-old tin construction with a good wick and a reservoir that he kept at a consistent fill level. The consistency was not casual. He had scratched a line on the reservoir's exterior, a mark he made whenever he established a fresh fill, so that he could see at a glance whether the oil level had changed. He filled it to the mark before any night work, and he refilled it when the level dropped below the mark, and he always put it away unlit on the center beam hook when the work was done. He was the kind of man who kept track of these things. The lantern was not the only thing he tracked. He tracked the water level in the stock trough, the hay supply against the expected length of winter, the condition of his tools and his harness and his fences. He tracked because tracking was how a man alone on a farm stayed ahead of the things that could go wrong. The lantern mark was part of this system, the same system he had been running for 8 years. He had left on the morning of October 14th with the lantern hanging on the hook and unlit. He was specific about this later. He had been in the barn that morning to check the water before leaving, and the lantern had been where he left it, unlit, its oil exactly at the mark. He had put the barn in order and latched it and driven south, planning to be back by the 17th. Ellen Cord saw the light at 11 on the night of October 15th. The lantern had been unlit when Meade left, and lit when Ellen saw it, which meant it had been lit at some point in the 36 hours between Meade's departure on the morning of the 14th and Ellen's sighting at 11 on the 15th. James's examination of the floor had found no footprints, which meant, if the soft mud floor of the barn was believed as evidence, that no one had walked to the lantern since the last rain, which had been the evening of the 13th. The lantern had been lit by someone who had not walked to it in the mud, or it had been lit before the mud was soft, which put the lighting before the evening of the 13th, which put the lighting before Meade left, which Meade's specific recollection contradicted. Ellen held this arithmetic through the night, and it did not improve with time. She had one more thought that she did not share with James, because it was the kind of thought that was better held privately, at least until she had more to build it with. She thought, "The lantern is burning, as though it expects someone to come in." She thought, "You lit a lantern in a barn because you needed to see, and you needed to see because you were going to do something, and you kept a lantern burning because the doing was ongoing." She thought, a lantern burning in an empty barn was a lantern burning in preparation for something that hadn't happened yet. Meade is coming back. The barn is keeping the light for when he comes back. That doesn't make sense. The lantern is burning. She filed all of this in the part of her mind where she put things that were true and also not yet understood, and she did not say it to James, and she went back to bed and lay in the dark and listened to the October hollow settle into its night sounds and thought about the light burning in the empty barn across the field. Word reached the hollow by morning, as word reached the hollow. carried by the specific mechanism of small communities that observed their neighbors with the practical attention that isolation required, that moved information between properties in the course of the ordinary transactions of a day. By the time the sun was over the ridge, 4 families in the hollow knew about the light in the mead barn. They came to look, not in a group, not with any formal purpose. They came the way they came to things that required looking at, individually and in pairs, arriving at the Cord farm first and then crossing the lower field to the mead barn. Ellen went with the first arrivals, and James went with the second, and they stood in the barn in the morning light and looked at the lantern. It was still burning. They stood inside the mead barn in the morning, and the lantern hung on the center beam hook and burned, and there was the specific quality of a moment when a thing you have been told about becomes a thing you are seeing yourself. Ellen had told them. James had told them. They had listened and understood, and now they were in the barn looking at the lit lantern in the empty barn in the October morning, and the understanding was different when you were standing in it. Margaret Pratt put her hand on the beam below the hook. She said, "It's warm. The beam is warm from the lantern. It's been burning." She said it with the quality of a statement confirming what they already knew from a different angle. Not that the lantern was burning now, which they could all see, but that it had been burning for long enough to warm the wood of the beam it hung from. Warmth in a beam on a cold October morning was warmth accumulated over hours. Nathan Webb, who was the hollow's most practically minded resident, and who had been a farmer in this hollow for 16 years, looked at the lantern for a long time. He looked at it the way he looked at equipment, with the attention of a man who knew what equipment did and didn't do, and who was trying to understand what this particular piece of equipment was doing. He said, "How long has it been burning?" Ellen said, "I saw it at 11 last night. It was burning then. I don't know how long before that." Nathan said, "A lantern this size. The reservoir on this kind of lantern holds enough oil for roughly 8 hours of steady burning. If it was lit at any point before midnight, it should be burning low by now." He paused. "It should be out if it was lit before 10. He looked at the flame. It was steady. Not high, not guttering, not the last burning of a wick that had reached the bottom of its oil. A mid-burn flame, the flame of a lantern that had several hours of oil left. Someone topped it off. He reached up and unhooked the lantern from the beam and held it level. He said, "It's half full." The barn was quiet. He said, "This lantern holds 8 hours of oil. If it was lit before midnight, it should be nearly out. If it was lit before the rain on the 13th, it should be long dark." He looked at the flame. Full. Steady. "Hours remaining." He said, "The oil is half full. This is not possible." He hung it back on the hook. Either someone refilled it, or it is not consuming oil the way a burning lantern consumes oil. I don't know which of those is worse. James Cord looked at the floor again, in the morning light, while the others were examining the lantern. The floor of the mead barn was packed earth in the older sections, and a mixture of earth and accumulated hay in the newer section, and around the center beam, where the lantern hung, the floor was the soft mud that the week's rain had made it. His own footprints from the previous night were visible, the clear impressions of his boots going to the lantern post and returning. And the older mead footprints from before, the rain were still faintly present in the areas that had dried first. Between his own footprints and the lantern post, the mud was clean. He crouched beside the post and looked at the ground around its base. The post stood in the soft mud, and the soft mud showed the circular impression of the post's base, and nothing else. No boot print, no impression of any kind between his own tracks and the post. He said to Nathan, "Come look at this." Nathan came and crouched beside him and said, "The post has been there since Meade built the barn. The mud around it was soft from the rain. It shows the post's base, nothing else." Nathan pressed his hand into the mud at the post's base. This took the impression of my hand. It would take the impression of a boot. James said, "Someone stood at this post to light the lantern. You can't reach the hook from 4 feet away. Whoever lit this lantern was standing at the base of this post." Nathan said, "And the mud shows nothing." James said, "You're right, the mud shows nothing." They looked at the clean mud around the post, and then up at the lantern hanging on its hook, and then at each other. Nathan said, "It was already lit before the rain softened the mud." James said, "Meade says it was unlit when he left. He says he checked it himself on the morning of the 14th. Nathan said, "Meade could be misremembering." James said, "Meade is very specific about the lantern. I know Meade, and I know how he keeps his barn. Meade marks the oil level. He checks the lantern before he leaves. Meade is not a man who misremembers the lantern." Nathan said, "Then we have a lantern that was lit without anyone standing at the post, with oil that is too high for the time elapsed, and a floor that shows nothing. I don't have an account for that." He said it simply, without drama, in the way of a man who had been looking at evidence all morning and had arrived at the honest boundary of what the evidence supported. Clara Webb, Nathan's wife, a woman of 43 who had been in the hollow for 16 years and who had a particular turn for close observation, spent the morning watching the lantern from outside the barn. She did this deliberately, standing at the barn's east wall, where a gap in the planking gave her a clear view of the center beam and the lantern hanging from it. She watched it for 2 hours, on and off, going away to do the morning's necessary work and coming back to the gap in the siding to watch again. She was watching for something specific. She had heard what James and Nathan had said about the floor and the oil, and she had stood with them at the post and looked at the mud, and she had then stepped outside and gone to the gap in the siding and watched the flame. She said to Nathan, at noon, "The flame." He said, "What about it?" She said, "It doesn't move." He said, "Lantern flames always move." She said, "This one doesn't. I've watched it for 2 hours in 4 separate intervals, and the flame has not moved. Not dramatically still, not frozen. It has the small variation of a flame burning steadily in still air. But this barn has gaps in the siding all along the north wall and the east wall, and a gap in the roof, boards above the loft. There is always air movement in this barn. I have been to this barn in all seasons, and there is always a small draft. The flame should move with the draft. It does not move with the draft." Nathan said, "How much movement are we talking about?" She said, "Enough to see at a lantern's flame. I've watched lanterns hanging in barns my entire life, and they move. Not dramatically, the small movements of a flame in a draft. This one has the small movements of a flame in still air. The air in this barn is not still. I'm not saying what that means. I'm telling you what I observed." Nathan went to the gap in the siding and watched the flame. After a few minutes, he came back and said nothing for a moment. He said, "You're right. I can feel the draft from this gap. The flame is not responding to it. I don't know what that means, either." They stood outside the Meade barn in the October morning, and the lantern burned inside it with the steadiness of something that was doing what it was doing and was not available for explanation. The hollow watched the barn through the afternoon. Not formally. No one had organized a watch. No one had decided that the barn required monitoring. But the people who had come to look in the morning found reasons to remain in the vicinity through the afternoon, doing the work that needed doing in the lower field and at the fence line, and on the Cord property, and looking at the barn when the work permitted looking. The lantern burned. It burned through the afternoon with the same quality it had had in the morning. Steady, warm, the specific orange glow of a healthy flame casting its lines of light through the gaps in the siding. The Hollow watched it and talked about it in the way of people who had examined a thing thoroughly and had not resolved it, returning to the evidence, finding no new angles, sitting with the inconclusiveness. James Cord went in again in the early afternoon. He went to check the oil level to see if it had dropped since the morning, the normal consumption of a burning lantern, the gradual decrease that would confirm the oil was behaving as oil should. He came back out and said, "I can't see a difference." Nathan said, "Meaning the oil hasn't dropped." James said, "Meaning I can't see that it has." Nathan said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "A lantern burning at this rate should have consumed half its reservoir in 8 hours. It's been burning since at least 11 last night. That's 15 hours. The oil should be almost gone." James said, "It's still half full." Nathan said, "Yes." He said it flatly, and the afternoon continued, and the lantern burned. John Pratt, who was the oldest person in the Hollow and who had been in the Ozark Hollow country since before most of the current families, came to look in the late afternoon. He came alone, walking slowly, and he stood outside the barn at the gap in the siding and looked at the flame for a long time. He did not go inside. He did not touch anything. He stood at the gap and watched the flame with the patient attention of a man watching something he was thinking about carefully. He said, when people came to stand near him, "I've been in this hollow 30 years. He said it in the way of a statement relevant to what came next. He said, "I've seen things in this hollow that I couldn't account for, the way you do in 30 years in a place. This is different from those." Nathan said, "How different?" John said, "Those were things that happened and were gone. This one is ongoing. It's been going for more than a day, and it shows no sign of stopping. A thing that's ongoing has a quality that a thing that happened once doesn't have. This lantern has decided to stay lit." He said it quietly, almost to himself, and then he went home. The Hollow stood with that for a while. Margaret Pratt said, "The oil. Nathan's accounting of the oil is what stays with me. Lantern either consumes its oil at the rate a lantern consumes oil, or it doesn't. If it's consuming oil at the normal rate, the timeline says it couldn't have been lit before the rain. If it was lit before the rain, the oil should be nearly gone by now. It's half full. That's the part I can't set aside." Nathan said, unless the lantern was filled again after the rain, by someone who walked to the post without leaving prints. Margaret said, "Yes, that's the other option." Nathan said, "Neither of those options is comfortable." Margaret said, "No." The afternoon moved toward evening, and the evening moved toward the time when the Hollow's people went inside for the night, and the lantern burned in the empty barn across the lower field with no sign of going out. James stood at the Cord Farm's fence at dusk and looked at the light in the barn. He had been in the barn twice. He had looked at the floor and the lantern and the mud and the oil. He had confirmed what was there and confirmed what wasn't. He knew what the barn held, and he knew what it didn't hold, and there was nothing in it that should cause him any hesitation. He thought about going in again. He stood at the fence and thought about it for a few minutes, and then he went inside his own house. He didn't have a reason not to go. That was the thing he turned over that evening. He had been in twice already, and nothing had happened, and the barn was empty, and the lantern was just a lantern. There was no reason not to walk across the field and open the barn door and go look at the oil level one more time in the evening light. He didn't go. He said to Ellen later, "I don't know why I didn't go. There was no reason not to. I just didn't." She said, "I know. I haven't been in since this morning. I've been watching it from the window." He said, "Yes," she said, "neither of us wants to go in at night." He said, "No." They sat with that and didn't examine it further, because examining it further would have required saying something that neither of them was ready to say. She had lain in bed through the early dark hours, and the thought of the lantern had been the kind of thought that displaced sleep. Not frightening, not alarming, but present in the way of something that had no resolution, and that her mind kept returning to when she stopped directing it elsewhere. She had seen it burn the night before, and it had burned through the day, and the sun had gone down, and she had not looked out the window yet on this second night, and she was aware of not having looked. She got up at some point past midnight and went to the kitchen window. The light was there. She stood at the window and watched it with the specific quality of attention she had brought to it the previous night, not looking for something to happen, not waiting for it to change, just looking. The barn was dark around the light, the siding gaps showing their bright thin lines, and the light was the same as it had been at 11 last night, and the same as it had been at noon today, and the same as it had been all afternoon. The same quality of flame, the same constancy. She thought about what Clara had said, that the flame did not move with the draft, that the air in the barn moved, but the flame did not respond to it. She thought about what that meant about the flame. She thought, a flame that does not respond to the air around it is a flame that is being attended. Not sheltered, not enclosed. The barn had gaps and was not airtight, but attended, as though something was keeping the air from reaching it, keeping it steady, keeping it at the temperature and the fuel level that a tended lantern maintained. She thought, whatever is keeping that lantern lit is attentive to it. That is the quality of it, attentive. The word had come to her, and it had not left. Not dangerous, not threatening, not the quality of something hostile to the people who lived near it. Attentive, the quality of something that had a task and was performing the task. The task is keeping the lantern lit. Why would something attend to a lantern in an empty barn? She stood at the window for 20 minutes, and the lantern burned, and she had no answer to that question, and she went back to bed. Josiah Meade returned on the morning of October 17th. He came up the valley road in the early morning, the wagon loaded lighter for the return trip, and he turned into his farmyard with the specific quality of attention he always brought to a return, looking at the property before he was fully in it, reading the state of it from the road, the way a man read the state of his land from a distance before he came close enough to miss things. The barn, the house, the outbuildings. He looked at all of them in the early morning light. The barn looked ordinary from the road. He unhitched his horse and turned her out to the pasture and went to the barn door and opened it. The lantern was dark. It was hanging on the center beam hook where he kept it. Dark and cold, the wick not smoking, no warmth to the tin, as though it had been sitting unlit for days. He stood in the barn doorway and looked at it, and then looked at the barn interior, the stalls, the floor, the center beam, and everything was as he had left it. The animals in the stalls were in order. The hay was as he had stacked it. The tools were in their places. He crossed to the lantern and unhooked it and held it. He had held this lantern so many times that he knew its weight at different oil levels, the way a man knew the weight of a familiar tool. He held it, now, and felt the weight, and the weight was wrong. Not heavy, which would have meant full, but heavier than it should have been after 4 days away. He held it and tried to read what the weight meant. He carried it to the barn door and held it up in the morning light. The oil reservoir had a scratch mark on the exterior, the line he had scratched when he last filled it, the mark he always made when he established a fresh fill level so that he could see at a glance whether the oil had been used. He had scratched the mark on the morning of October 14th before he left. He looked at the oil level through the reservoir's glass, held up against the October morning sky. The oil was above the mark. He looked at it for a long time. Not significantly above, not the dramatic overfill of a reservoir that had been refilled carelessly to the brim. A small, specific amount above the scratch. The amount you would see if you topped off a reservoir that had consumed perhaps a quarter of its oil, added back what was missing, brought it close to, but not quite at the full level. He stood in the barn doorway and held the lantern and thought about what he was looking at. He had scratched the mark when the lantern was full. He had left it unlit. He had been away 4 days. An unlit lantern did not consume oil. The oil should have been at the mark, exactly at the mark where he had put it. The oil was above the mark. He looked at the mark and looked at the oil level and looked at the mark again. He was a man who scratched marks precisely. He was not misreading his own mark. The oil was above it. He set the lantern carefully on the post and went to the tack room and checked his oil store. The container was at the level he had left it. The lock was as he had left it. He came back to the lantern. He was still standing with it when James Cord came across the lower field. James told him what had happened. He told it in order. Ellen's sighting at 11 on the E, 15th. His own inspection of the floor and the empty barn. Nathan's examination of the oil level in the morning. Clara's observations of the flame. The watching through the afternoon and the second night. The lantern dark when they came to look in the morning of the 17th. Meade listened to all of it. He said, "I left it unlit." James said, "I know. I checked it on the morning of the 14th. I always check it before a trip. The oil was at the mark and the lantern was unlit." He held up the lantern. "The oil is above the mark now." James said, "Nathan thought someone had refilled it." Meade said, "Nobody has access to my oil store. I keep it in the locked corner of the tack room. The lock is as I left it." He went to the tack room and checked the oil store. The container was at the level he had left it, the lock undisturbed. He came back to the center of the barn and stood under the hook where the lantern hung. He said, "The oil in the lantern is higher than when I left. The oil in the store is at the level I left it. No oil has been taken from the store to add to the lantern. I don't know where the oil came from." He hung the lantern back on the hook and stood in the barn in the morning of his return and looked at it. "It was unlit when I left. You saw it, lit. It's dark now. The oil is higher than I left it. I've been in this barn every day for 8 years, and I have never left the lantern lit, and it has never lit itself." He said this, and then he was quiet. The specific quiet of a man who had arrived at the edge of what he could say confidently, and who was choosing to stop there rather than step beyond it. James said nothing. They stood in the Meade barn in the October morning, and the lantern was dark, and the oil was above the mark, and the floor was dry and ordinary, and the barn was as it had always been. The hollow held the account of the Meade barn lantern for the rest of that autumn and into the winter, and the holding was the specific holding of a community that had good evidence and no explanation. The same evidence examined from different angles, the same conclusions reached, the same gap in the accounting sitting at the center of every conversation that returned to it. Nathan Webb never found an explanation that satisfied him. He went through the mechanics of it many times. The oil consumption, the floor, the flame's stillness, the locked oil store, Meade's specific recollection of the unlit lantern on the morning of departure, the oil above the mark on Meade's return. He assembled these facts and looked at them from every angle he could find, and the angles all arrived at the same place. He said, in the last conversation the Hollow had about it, before the winter made other things more pressing, the oil above the mark is the part I keep coming back to. He said, the oil below the mark would have said someone used the lantern and the oil ran down. He said, the oil at the mark would have said no one touched it, and it sat unlit. He said, the oil above the mark says something that neither of those says. Oil above the mark means oil was added. Oil was added to a lantern that was burning in a locked barn by someone who did not walk to it in the mud and did not take oil from the supply store. I've spent the autumn trying to find the version of this account where a person did it. A person who was there before the rain, who lit the lantern before the rain softened the mud, who refilled it somehow without accessing the oil store, who left and left no trace. I can construct part of that account. I can't construct all of it. The oil above the mark is not consistent with a person who lit the lantern before the rain and never came back. Oil only goes above the mark if oil was added after Meade's scratch. Meade scratched that mark the morning of the 14th. The oil is above that mark on the morning of the 17th. He paused. I believe the facts. I believe the floor and the oil in Meade's mark. The facts say something I don't have a category for, and I've decided to hold them as facts and leave the category empty. The barn did something that the barn should not have been able to do, and it did it while Meade was away, and it stopped when Meade came back. He was quiet for a moment, or it was done for Meade. The lantern burning while Meade was away, kept burning as though the barn knew he was coming back. I don't have language for that. I keep thinking it anyway. By morning, the lantern was dark. No one had seen it go out, and no one ever said they had lit it. But the oil was still above the mark.